So, the phone call Camilla made the night Diana died wasn't made after the news broke. It was made before. And the person who finally confirmed the detail wasn't a journalist. It wasn't a palace source speaking anonymously to a tabloid at 2 in the morning. It wasn't a biographer with an agenda or a former royal staff member settling a score 20 years after they stopped getting paid to stay quiet. It was Charles himself. In a private conversation. In a room he believed was sealed. In words that were never supposed to travel beyond the walls where he spoke them, and yet here we are, 28 years after the night in question, and those words are moving. They are moving through the channels that serious information always moves through before it breaks into the open. Slowly at first. Then all at once. Now. Before we go any further, I want to be precise about something. Because precision is the thing that separates what I'm about to tell you from the version of this story that's been circulating in the wrong places for the wrong reasons. The detail that is wrong, the detail that has always been wrong, is not that Camilla made a phone call that night. That part, the basic fact of a phone call existing, has been known or at least suspected by people close to this situation for a long time. That is not the revelation. The detail that is wrong is the sequence. When did Charles receive confirmation from Paris that Diana was gone? When specifically did he place that call to Camilla? And what is the number that sits between those two moments? The gap. The minutes. Because that gap, that specific window of time, has never been explained publicly. Not in 28 years of books and documentaries and inquiries and carefully managed royal narratives. The number exists. People who were at Balmoral that night know the number. And the decision, the very deliberate, very coordinated decision, to keep that number out of every public account of what happened has held for nearly 3 decades. Until Charles said what he said. In a room with a door that wasn't completely closed. And here is what I need you to understand about why that matters. Because I can already hear the version of this that gets dismissed, the people who will say it's speculation, the people who will say it's tabloid fodder dressed up in more sophisticated language, the people who will reach for the word conspiracy and use it as a way to stop thinking rather than a reason to start. This is not that. What this has always been, is a question about sequence. A question about the order of events on a specific night, in a specific house, involving a specific set of phone calls. And the reason that question has been treated for 28 years as something that cannot be asked in polite company, something that serious people don't engage with, something that gets quietly steered away from every time it gets too close to the surface, that reason is not because the answer is benign. If the answer were benign, someone would have given it a long time ago. They didn't. And they haven't. And now Charles has said something in a room that he didn't realize wasn't private, and that something is moving, and the people who have spent nearly 3 decades managing the distance between what happened and what the public was permitted to believe are not, for the first time, entirely certain they can close the distance again. This wasn't a husband calling the woman he loved to deliver the most devastating news of their lives. This was something that happened in a sequence. A specific, documented, knowable sequence that nobody inside that palace has ever been willing to explain in full. Until now. Stay with me. Because where this goes, the rooms it moves through, the people it touches, what it means for everything we thought we understood about that night is not something you're going to want to walk away from halfway through. Let's go back to the night itself. Because the night itself is where everything begins, and most people, even people who have spent years thinking about this, don't actually know the full shape of it. August 31st, 1997. Balmoral Castle, Scotland. Charles is there with William and Harry. The boys are asleep. It is, by all accounts, a quiet evening before the world changed. The first call from Paris arrives sometime after midnight. This is the call that tells Balmoral that there has been an accident. That Diana is injured. That she is being treated. That the situation is serious but, and this word, this qualification, matters enormously, she is alive. She is alive when that first call is made. The people at Balmoral who receive that information process it the way you process information about a serious accident. There is alarm. There is urgency. But there is also still time. The second call comes approximately an hour later. That call has a different message. And in the space between those two calls, in that hour, in that specific window of time when Balmoral knew the situation was critical but did not yet know it was final, things happened. Decisions were made. Phones were used. And the question of exactly who Charles called during that hour, in what order, and what he said to them, is the question that the public version of this story has never been able to fully answer. Not because the answer doesn't exist, but because the answer was buried very deliberately, very early, by people who understood exactly what it meant. Here is the version you know. Charles receives word that Diana has died. He is devastated. He is in shock. His primary focus, immediately and completely, is on his two sons sleeping upstairs, two boys who are about to lose their mother and who do not yet know it. Everything he does in those hours is oriented around them. Around protecting them. Around being the father they are going to need in the hours and days and years ahead. That is the public narrative. That is the version that has been maintained, reinforced, and carefully restated every time this period comes under scrutiny. For 28 years. Now here is the private reality. The first person Charles called after receiving confirmation from Paris was not a member of the royal family. It was not a senior advisor. It was not the Queen, who was also at Balmoral and would have been, by any conventional protocol, the first person a son calls when something of this magnitude occurs. It was not anyone at Buckingham Palace. It was not a doctor, a secretary, a priest, or any of the categories of person that the official account would later imply were the focus of those early hours. It was Camilla. And that call, that specific call, placed to that specific person, in that specific window between the accident and the confirmation of death, is the thing that the royal communications apparatus has worked, quietly and consistently and with considerable skill, to keep out of every mainstream account of that night for nearly 3 decades. Now ask yourself why. Not in the abstract. Not as a rhetorical exercise. Actually ask yourself why a machine as sophisticated and experienced as the British royal press operation would dedicate that level of sustained, long-term effort to keeping one phone call out of the public record. What is it about that phone call, about its timing, about its recipient, about what it reveals about the priorities of the man who made it, that required that degree of protection? The answer is not complicated. It is just uncomfortable. Because if you are Charles in that moment, if you have just been told that the woman the entire world still thinks of as your real wife, the mother of your children, the most photographed person on the planet and the one the public has never stopped loving, if you have just been told that she is gone, and the first thing you do, the very first thing, is reach for the phone to call the woman that same public blames for destroying that marriage. You are not thinking about how that looks. You already know exactly how it looks. And you are calling anyway. That tells you something. Not about guilt. Not about conspiracy. But about the depth of what was actually there and what the palace understood, immediately, could never be allowed to become part of the official record of that night. 28 years later. A private room at Windsor. No staff present. No recording equipment. No official protocol activated, no communications secretary positioned outside the door with a notepad and a carefully prepared set of talking points. Just Charles, and a person he trusts with the kind of completeness that takes decades to build and that very few people in his position have ever been able to afford. The door is not completely closed. That detail matters. Not because someone was standing in the corridor with the explicit intention of listening, but because information inside royal households has always traveled the same way, through gaps, through the spaces between things, through the moments when the architecture of secrecy develops a flaw that nobody planned for and nobody catches in time. The most consequential things ever said inside these buildings were never said for an audience. They were said because the person speaking them had, for one reason or another, stopped performing the calculation they had spent their entire life performing. The calculation of what can be spoken aloud and what must remain internal, permanently, until it dies with the person carrying it. Charles, in this room, on this evening, is not performing that calculation. What happens next does not come through a journalist. It does not arrive via a formal statement or a leaked document or a palace source briefing a correspondent over lunch at somewhere discreet in Westminster. It surfaces the way the most important information inside this family has always surfaced, through someone who was close enough to hear, attentive enough to remember, and who eventually reached the point where silence was no longer something they could continue to choose. Not out of malice. Not for money. But because there is a weight to knowing something for long enough that it stops feeling like information and starts feeling like a debt. And this is what Charles says. Not as a confession. Not as an apology. Not with the register of a man who has finally decided to unburden himself in the dramatic way that the word confession implies. He says it the way a person says something they have carried for so long that the carrying of it has become indistinguishable from breathing, and then, without deciding to, they simply exhale. Flat. Quiet. Certain. She knew before the boys did. I needed her to know first. I have never once been sorry for that. The person in the room does not respond. There is no follow-up question. There is no visible reaction recorded, no sharp intake of breath, no moment of confrontation or validation or any of the things that a scene like this would contain if it were written rather than lived. There is simply the silence of someone who has just heard a thing they know they will never stop hearing. The kind of sentence that doesn't lodge in memory, it lodges somewhere deeper than that. In the part of you that processes things not as information but as events. Things that happen to you, rather than things you simply receive. Charles leaves that room carrying something heavier than relief. He is not lighter for having said it. That is the thing about this kind of truth, it does not behave the way confession is supposed to behave. It does not release the person who speaks it. What it does instead is begin a journey of its own. It moves out of the room and into the person who heard it, and from there into the network of people connected to that person, and from there outward, along channels that no palace communications team has the reach to monitor or the power to close. A sentence of 30 words. A door that was not completely shut. And 28 years of carefully maintained silence beginning, at last, to come apart at the place where it was always going to come apart first, not from the outside, but from within. Let's talk about the numbers. Because the numbers are where abstraction ends and reality begins, and the reality of this particular night is something that gets sanitized every time it gets retold into something more bearable than what it actually was. Diana was pronounced dead at 4 a.m. Paris time. 2 a.m. London time. August 31st, 1997. William was 15 years old. Harry was 12. They were asleep at Balmoral when their mother died. They were asleep when their father received the confirmation call from Paris. They were asleep during whatever happened in the hour between the first call and the second. They were asleep while the adults in that house made decisions and placed calls and began the process of managing what was, by any measure, one of the most consequential nights in the modern history of the British monarchy. And they did not find out until their father walked into their rooms before dawn and told them. Hold that window of time in your mind. The window between the moment Diana died and the moment her sons were woken to be told. Everything I am about to lay out happened inside that window. Now. Before August 31st, you need to understand what already existed between Charles and Camilla, because the phone call that night did not happen in isolation. It happened as the latest moment in a pattern that had been documented, recorded, and in one case literally broadcast to the public 4 years earlier. 1993. The Camilla Gate tapes. A recorded phone conversation between Charles and Camilla, intercepted and eventually published, that revealed something the palace had spent years carefully obscuring. Not just that the relationship existed, that had been suspected for a long time by that point. What the tapes revealed was the texture of the dependency. The emotional register. The degree to which Charles, in private, related to Camilla in ways he had never once demonstrated publicly toward Diana. The intimacy in those recordings was not the intimacy of an affair. It was the intimacy of a primary relationship. The kind that reorganizes everything around it. The palace never explained the tapes. They waited. They managed the immediate damage, they relied on the public's relatively short attention span for things that couldn't be photographed, and they waited for it to recede. And it did recede, the way things always recede when the news cycle moves on and nothing official is ever confirmed. But the tapes existed. They still exist. And what they established, permanently, for anyone paying attention, was that Camilla was not peripheral to Charles's emotional life. She was central to it. more central than anything he had ever allowed the public to see. Which means that on the night of August 31st, when Charles needed to tell someone when he needed, in the most human and least managed sense of that word, to reach for the person who was the center of his interior life, the person he reached for was entirely predictable. What was not predictable was the sequence. The doctors at Petit-Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris followed a protocol for notifying next of kin and relevant authorities. That protocol has a specific order. The British ambassador was notified. The Queen's private secretary was notified. A sequence of calls moved through official channels in the way that official channels are designed to move. Camilla Parker Bowles was not in any of those channels. And yet she knew before the boys did. She knew before the two people with the most fundamental claim to that information, the people who called Diana their mother, were told anything at all. That is not a detail. That is not a footnote. That is the entire architecture of the story, and it has been sitting in plain sight for 28 years, waiting for someone to say it plainly. So let me say it plainly. In the hours after Diana died, the order of priority inside that house was not what the public version of events has ever been allowed to suggest. And the person who confirmed that order confirmed it without equivocation, without apology, in 30 words in a room with a door that wasn't completely shut, is the same person who has spent the better part of 3 decades allowing a different version to stand unchallenged. Here is the thing about patterns inside the royal family. They don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with documentation or timestamps or any of the things that would make them easy to identify and easy to dismiss. They accumulate. Quietly, over years, over decades, through incidents that each look isolated until you step back far enough to see what they are actually forming. And what they have been forming, in this case, is a through line that runs from 1993 to 1997 to right now. 3 points. Same shape. Same logic. Same institution making the same calculation each time, that silence is more survivable than explanation, that waiting is more effective than responding, and that the public's willingness to move on can always be relied upon. Until it can't. 1993. The Camilla Gate tapes surface. A private conversation between Charles and Camilla, recorded without their knowledge and published without their consent, that collapses the distance between the public version of their relationship and the private reality of it in a single news cycle. The palace does not respond. It does not explain, contextualize, apologize, or acknowledge. It simply absorbs the impact and waits. And within months the tapes have moved from front pages to footnotes, and the official narrative, that Charles and Diana's marriage broke down for complex and mutual reasons, that no single person or relationship was responsible, continues to hold its shape in public discourse. That was the first time the machine demonstrated what it could do. 1997. The night itself. The sequence of calls. The window between Diana's death and the moment her sons were told. A detail that, in the atmosphere of that specific year when an entire country was processing grief and looking for somewhere to direct it, would have been not just damaging but potentially destabilizing in ways that the institution was not equipped to survive. So the detail was buried. Not loudly. Not through any single dramatic act of suppression. But through the accumulated decisions of everyone who knew it to treat it as the kind of thing that serious people do not discuss. And it held. For 28 years it held. That was the second time the machine demonstrated what it could do. And now the third point on the line. Charles is ill. He is older than he has ever been, which sounds obvious but carries a specific weight for a man who spent the first 74 years of his life in preparation for a role he has now held for only a handful of years. He is having conversations in private rooms that are less controlled than the conversations he had for the previous 7 decades. He is saying things, not recklessly, not carelessly, but with the particular quality of a person who has begun to feel, perhaps for the first time, that the cost of continued containment is higher than the cost of release. The people who were at Balmoral that night. The people who handled royal communications in those hours. The people who were asked, explicitly or implicitly, to treat the sequence of those phone calls as information that did not exist. They have been silent for nearly 30 years. Not because they forgot. Because they understood, with complete clarity, exactly what they were holding, and they were waiting, with equal clarity, for the moment when holding it was no longer the right choice. That moment has arrived. Let's talk about what makes this different. Because there have been royal scandals before. There have been leaks and revelations and carefully sourced exclusives that promised to change everything and then, in the way of things, changed less than they threatened to. The machinery of the institution absorbed them. The news cycle moved. The narrative held. This is not that. And the reason this is not that comes down to something very simple, very structural, and very difficult for the palace to manage its way around. There is no law that prevents Charles from saying what he wants to say in a private room. There is no royal protocol, no constitutional mechanism, no communication strategy, however sophisticated, that can prevent information from traveling once the person who holds it has, consciously or not, decided to release it. The entire architecture of royal information control is built on the assumption that the people inside the institution want to stay inside it. That they understand the value of containment and choose it, every time, over the alternative. That calculation has held for generations. It requires the cooperation of the person at the center. And the person at the center is no longer cooperating in the way he once did. This is the unprecedented element. In the modern history of the British monarchy, there is no comparable instance of a reigning sovereign confirming, even in a private setting, even without the explicit intention of making it public, information of this sensitivity about events surrounding the death of his former wife. Not through a journalist. Not through a hostile source with an agenda. Not through a book or a documentary or any of the formats that the institution has learned to prepare for and respond to. Through his own words, in his own voice, in a room he believed was sealed. The historians who study this institution professionally say they cannot find a precedent for it. That is not a rhetorical flourish. That is a structural fact about what is happening, and it matters because it means the playbook the palace would normally reach for in a situation like this does not exist. They are navigating without a map. And the silence from the institution confirms it. There has been no statement from Clarence House. No response, formal or informal, from Kensington Palace. No royal correspondent has been quietly briefed with a counter-narrative, no friendly columnist has published a measured piece of contextualization, none of the moves that the royal communications apparatus makes when it has decided on a strategy have been made. The silence is not the silence of an organization preparing to deny. It is the silence of an organization that has concluded, with the cold clarity of genuine crisis management, that denial would be worse than nothing. That any response is more dangerous than no response. That the only move available is to wait and hope that the thing moves slowly enough to be managed before it moves fast enough to be irreversible. Consider the line that runs through all of it. Camillagate in '93. The night at Balmoral in '97. The marriage in 2005 and the promises made then about titles and roles that were later quietly unmade. The Queen Consort designation in 2023. And now this, a sentence in a room with a door that wasn't completely closed, at the end of a life spent understanding better than almost anyone alive what can and cannot be safely spoken aloud. Every point on that line was survivable. The question the institution is sitting with right now is whether the line itself is. When something like this begins to move, it doesn't move evenly. It moves in tiers. And the way you read how serious it actually is, how far it has already traveled, how much of the structure it has already reached, is not by watching what people say. It is by watching what they don't say. And how they don't say it. Tier 1 is visible. Clarence House has issued no public comment since information about Charles's conversation at Windsor began circulating through private channels. Camilla has appeared at 2 official engagements in the past week. Composed. Precise. The smile placed correctly, the timing of every gesture exactly where 2 decades of practice have taught her to place it. Nothing on the surface that would give a photographer or a correspondent anything to work with. But 2 interviews that were scheduled, both of them, have been quietly cancelled. No explanation given. No reschedule announced. They are simply no longer happening, in the way that things inside this institution simply stop happening when the people managing them have decided that any additional visibility carries more risk than the absence of it. That is Tier 1. Managed. Controlled. Recognizable as the kind of response the machine produces when it is functioning. Tier 2 is different. William knows about the conversation. According to people familiar with the situation at Kensington Palace, he was informed before the information began moving through wider channels. Someone made sure of that. Whether that was a courtesy or a calculation, whether it was done out of genuine concern for him or out of the institutional understanding that a Prince of Wales who was blindsided is more dangerous than one who has been prepared, is not entirely clear. What is clear is that he was told. And his response was not what the people around him anticipated. They expected anger. That would have been the legible response. The response that is precedent, that fits within a known emotional vocabulary, that can be managed and absorbed and eventually resolved through the established channels that exist precisely for moments like this one. Anger is workable. Anger has a shape. What William produced instead was silence. A long silence, by the account of one person present. And then a single question. How much more has he said? Not a statement. Not a confrontation. A question. And the specific quality of that question, the way it assumes that what has surfaced is not the totality but only the beginning, the way it treats this not as an incident but as an opening, tells you everything about where William's mind has gone and why the people around him are finding his composure more unsettling than his anger would have been. Tier 3 is where the real weight of this sits. If Charles said this in a room he believed was private, said it without apparent awareness that the words would travel, then the question that follows is not containable. What else has he said? In which rooms? To which people? In the months since his illness began progressively releasing him from the protocols that governed every conversation he had for the previous 70 years. The palace is working to answer that question before anyone else does. They are working very hard and very quietly. And they are not certain they are working fast enough. Trooping the color is coming. The first time Charles, Camilla, and William will stand together on that balcony since the conversation at Windsor began to move. Every person in that building on that day will understand what they are watching. And not one of them will be using the usual word for it this year. Watch Camilla at her last public engagement. Stand there and watch her the way you watch someone who has spent 20 years learning to be watched. The posture is perfect. The smile arrives exactly when it is supposed to arrive and disappears exactly when it is supposed to disappear. The wave, the particular angle of it, the controlled warmth of it, the way it manages to look natural despite being one of the most practiced gestures in the world, lands exactly right. Every element of the surface is exactly where 2 decades of the most unforgiving public scrutiny imaginable has taught her to place it. And somewhere behind the closed doors of Clarence's house, a sentence her husband spoke in a room with a door that wasn't completely shut is continuing its journey. Moving through people. Moving through channels. Moving at the speed that serious information moves when it has finally cleared the walls that were built to contain it and found open ground. 30 words. That is all it was. 30 words spoken without apology, without performance, with the flat certainty of a man who has carried something for so long that he has stopped being able to feel the weight of it as separate from himself. 30 words that confirmed a sequence. A timeline. A specific order of priority on a specific night that the most sophisticated royal communications machine in the world spent 28 years ensuring would never be confirmed. So here is the question. Not the question everyone has been asking, not whether Charles called Camilla before the boys were told, because that question now has an answer. The real question. The one that matters more than the fact itself. Why now? After 28 years of silence, in a room he believed was sealed, at this particular moment in a life that has very few moments left of the kind that allow for things to simply slip out, why did he say it? Whether that was a choice or something that happened in the space where choices used to be made is something only one person alive can answer. And that person is not going to be asked. Because the secrets inside this family do not die when the people holding them decide to stay silent. They die when the people holding them are no longer.